Welcome, everyone. It is so good to have you here this weekend. I want to welcome not only those of you who are attending one of our campuses, but I also want to give a very warm welcome to any of you who may be watching this message online. I got a great email a couple of weeks ago from somebody who's been watching online, and I just wanted to share it with you because I think all of you will find this encouraging. This is from a young man by the name of Matt, and he and his family attend church here. And he talks about what the church means to him, but then he goes on to say this. He says, over the past 7 months, I've been missing services due to a deployment to Afghanistan. He said, my wife has been doing a terrific job sending me the sound recordings of every new series that comes out. Listening to them every week has been a huge highlight of this trip. Recently, I found out that you've been posting the video recordings of each week on your website. I can't describe to you how much that means to me, being able to watch those videos from halfway around the world. Even though the internet is very slow and it takes over 12 hours to fully download, I am always very patient. I just want to send a special thank you and let you know what a wonderful job you've been doing and for making this uncomfortable and long trip just that much more enjoyable. So I just want to start by saying, hey, Matt, hope you're doing well. Thank you for serving our country there in Afghanistan. And wherever you happen to be hearing this message this weekend, we just pray that God will really do something in your heart as we learn together. Today we're continuing this teaching series from the book of James. It's called Faith in Motion. And the idea behind this teaching series is this, that if our faith is real, it won't just be confined to an hour on Sunday mornings. It'll be living and active and in motion all the time. And today, I want to talk to you about what to do, how to put your faith in motion when everything within you just wants to quit. How do you put your faith in motion when you just want to give up? And as a way of kind of setting up the teaching today, I want to read a story. This is from the book called In the Eye of the Storm by Max Lucado. And I think this is a true story, but it goes like this. Chippy the parakeet never saw it coming. One second he was peacefully perched in his cage. The next he was sucked in, washed up, and blown over. The problems began when Chippy's owner decided to clean Chippy's cage with a vacuum cleaner. She removed the attachment from the end of the hose and stuck it in the cage. The phone rang, and she turned to pick it up. She had barely said hello when Chippy got sucked in. The bird owner gasped, dropped the phone, turned off the vacuum cleaner, and opened the bag. There was Chippy, still alive but stunned. Since the bird was covered with dust, hair, and all the stuff you find in a dust bag, she grabbed him and raced to the bathroom, turned on the tap, and held Chippy under the running water. Then, realizing that Chippy was soaked and shivering, she did what any compassionate bird owner would do. She reached for the hairdryer and blasted the pet with hot air. Poor Chippy never knew what hit him. A few days after the trauma, a friend called Chippy's owner to see how the bird was recovering. Well, she replied, Chippy doesn't sing anymore. He just sits and stares. Anybody here that can identify with Chippy the parakeet besides me? Isn't it true that there are just some times in life when you face circumstances that leave us so beat up that our joy is gone and our passion is gone, and it's like all you can do is sit and stare? You ever had a day like that? You ever had a month like that? You ever had a year like that? What do you do when life leaves you feeling beat up, when you're just kind of been run through the shredder because of all the frustrations and disappointments and all the difficulties in life? Well, we've been working our way through this first century letter called the book of James. And James, we're coming to the end here, and as he begins to wrap up this letter, he writes to these believers and he addresses this problem of pain and suffering. And in my opinion, this one issue, the issue of pain and suffering, has the potential to stall our faith and keeps many people away from faith in God like nothing else can. Because whenever we encounter pain and suffering, it just raises so many questions that we have, like, God, where are you? And God, why did you allow this to happen? And God, when is this going to stop? You know, I think the believers in the first century who read this letter for the first time, I think they probably had many of those same questions because they were living in very, very difficult circumstances. And I think at times they must have felt like Chippy the parakeet. In fact, if you go back to chapter 1 and verse 1, here's how this letter begins that James wrote to these believers. It says, James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes, is a way of saying that they were Jewish believers, to the 12 tribes scattered among the nations. And of course, the obvious question is this: why were they scattered? If you turn back a little ways in the Bible, you find out. Acts chapter 8 says this, that a great persecution broke out against the church at Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. So what you have to understand is that James wrote this letter to believers who had been persecuted and were uprooted and who were literally running for their lives. And I believe that there must have been some of them who might have asked themselves or said to themselves, you know, I became a Christian and look where it's gotten me. I mean, I've lost my income. I've lost my home. My family is struggling just to get by. I mean, I'm ready just to give up and throw in the towel. So how do you put your faith in motion when you want to give up? That's what we're going to talk about today. There's a note sheet inside your bulletin. You go ahead and take that out. It's the white bulletin insert. That will give you a way to follow along and a place to write some things down. And this is our last week for the J5 Challenge. I hope you've been doing that. We're going to wrap that up this week. But here in chapter 5, James writes this letter and gives these believers the answer to dealing with the pain and injustice and the suffering that we sometimes face in life. And I'll just warn you right up front. You may not like his answer, because I don't like his answer. Chapter 5, beginning of verse 7, look at the first two words here. Be patient. Okay, see, I don't want to be patient. When I feel like life is beating me up, you know, and when I feel like life is unfair, I want it fixed. I want it changed. I want something done about it, like now. I don't want to be patient. But James says, be patient. And then he repeats this idea 3 more times in the next 4 verses. Verse 7, he says, you need to be patiently waiting. Verse 8, you too, he repeats it, be patient. And then verse 10, he gets very specific about what kind of patience. Patience in the face of suffering. Now, patience is not something that comes easily to me, and I don't think it's something that comes easily to any of us in our culture, because we live in a culture of 30-second TV commercials and microwave dinners and text messages and fast food, and we don't like to be patient. But James, he doesn't just say, be patient and leave it at that. He gives us the motivation. He gives us a reason why we can and should be patient. There are some key phrases that come up in this passage. Let me point them out to you. Verse 7, he says, be patient then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. There's where the hope is. Verse 8, you too be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. Verse 9, don't grumble against one another, brothers and sisters, because when life is tough, you tend to turn on those closest to you. Don't grumble against one another, brothers and sisters, or you will be judged. And then he says this, the judge is standing at the door. In other words, James is reminding these suffering believers of a truth that you find all throughout the Bible, and a truth that is foundational to our faith. It is this, that the ultimate answer to the pain and suffering in your life will not be found in this life. That the ultimate solution to all the frustration and disappointment in this world will not be found in this world as we know it. That the only way to have peace and the only way to have patience in the midst of all the disappointments and the frustrations of life is to look beyond this life. And if I could put that into one simple statement, I would say it this way. When you're tired from the journey, remind yourself of the destination. When you're tired from the journey, remind yourself of the destination. Let me tell you a story from my own life that helps you understand what this means. When I was in college, I think it was my junior year, 5 of my friends and I decided that we were going to spend our spring break in Key West, Florida. Okay? Now, I went to school right here in northeastern Pennsylvania, where winters are long and most days are cloudy. So the prospect of going to Key West, Florida, that was exciting. I mean, we looked forward to this like nothing else. Now, we were college students and we were pretty poor and didn't want to spend a lot of money on gas, so we decided to take one vehicle that was a mid-sized car that would be pretty economical on gas. Now, there were 6 of us. I was the smallest guy in the group, okay? One of the guys in the group was 6'5" tall. His brother was 6'7". I mean, we were crammed into this car, the 6 of us. And to make matters worse, when we were packing the car to leave, we realized that all of our stuff wasn't going to fit in the trunk. And so everybody but the driver had to hold something on this trip. Okay, 6 of us crammed in this car holding stuff, 27-hour drive. And of course, we didn't want to pay for an extra night at a hotel, so we drove straight through. The air conditioner in the car was broken. I was a college student. The antenna was broken off, so the radio didn't work. We did have a cassette tape player, but for some reason, we only thought to bring one cassette tape. It was the greatest hits of the Carpenters. I'm not making this up. You know, we've only just begun. You know, about 200 miles into the trip, one of the guys literally threw the tape out the window. Okay? This was a long, tiring, and sometimes tense journey. But every once in a while, when the journey started to get long, when we started to get a little bit impatient with each other, we just had to remind ourselves of one thing. We're going to Florida. We are going to Key West. Because when you're tired from the journey, what you've got to do is you've got to remind yourself of the destination. And let me tell you something. One of the reasons why I think we get so discouraged sometimes in this life is because we forget that this is not the destination. That this is not our true home. And there are so many people in this world who spend so much time and energy and money just trying to create a little bit of heaven around them in this world, to try to make this their home. But eventually, you know what we all figure out? When we get old enough, or we spend enough money, or spend enough time trying, or our health begins to fail, we all begin to figure out what James is talking about here, that this isn't our home. That this is not heaven. It never will be. And this is not the ultimate destination. And when we figure that out, and when we live with that at the forefront of our minds, we're going to have a whole lot more joy, a whole lot more peace, and a whole lot more patience. Because when the journey begins to get tiring, you got to remind yourself of the destination. So here in this passage, James talks about 3 times in life when we need to have patience and when it's hard to have patience, and he illustrates it with 3 different people. He talks about a farmer, he talks about prophets, and he talks about a man named Job. Let me tell you about the first time when it's really hard to be patient. It's when you sacrifice, but you don't see the results. And if you're serious about following Christ, at some point in your Christian experience, if you haven't hit this point already, there is going to come a point where you may start to grow weary, and you look around at everybody else in this world and you begin to ask yourself, you know, why am I doing this? Why am I serving? Why am I sacrificing? Why am I attending? Why am I missing out? And we can begin to get weary and wonder if it's worth it. And here's what it says in verse 7. James says, "See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, and how patient he is for the autumn and spring rains." Now, anybody who's done any farming or any gardening knows that if you're going to be a farmer, the one thing that you have to have is patience. Because every spring, the farmer puts a huge investment in the ground. An investment of his time and his sweat, his energy and his money. He puts that seed in the ground. And what is the immediate result of that? Nothing. He has to wait. He's got to wait for the rain to fall and the seed to germinate and that plant to break through the soil and that plant to mature and for a crop to form. But eventually his patience pays off and he's rewarded by reaping a harvest. And in verse 8, James goes on to say this. He says, "You too, like a farmer, be patient." And then he gives a 2-word application. Be patient and stand firm. Because when you've been faithful to God for a long time and it doesn't feel like it's making a difference, then the temptation is to not stand firm. The temptation is to give up. And James says, don't give up. Don't get weary in doing good. He says, stand firm. And my friends, when we serve God And when we love others and when we live for His kingdom, we do it knowing that eventually there will be a harvest, that someday, maybe not even in this life, we will stand before Him and we will be rewarded for the investments that we have made in the things that really matter. You see this idea in a book of the Bible called Galatians chapter 6. It says, "Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially to those who belong to the family of believers." And I love that phrase there, at the proper time we will reap a harvest. At the proper time, meaning we must be patient. And see, every farmer can tell you that the reward of a good harvest was worth the wait. It's always worth the wait. So that's the first time in life when we need patience, is when we sacrifice but don't seem to see any results from it. Here's the second time when you really need patience, and that's when you live the right way and get treated the wrong way. I mean, it's hard to be patient when that happens, right? It's kind of like the guy who was sitting in traffic on the Los Angeles freeway. And he's in the middle of a traffic jam, and the guy behind him starts to honk his horn. Not just once, but over and over again. And it's wall-to-wall traffic. It's backed up for miles. And this guy behind him is honking his horn. And he finally has enough, and he gets out of his car and he walks back there. And he says, "Buddy, what's your problem? This traffic is not moving. This traffic jam is miles long, and you're blowing your horn. What is your problem?" And the guy behind him very timidly says, "Well, it's your bumper sticker. It says, 'Honk if you love Jesus.' And I love Jesus, so I was honking." Like, sometimes even when you do the right thing, you do what you're supposed to do, you suffer for it. That's just the way it is in this world. And so James says in verse 10, "Brothers and sisters, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord." Of course, you know, James here, he's writing to first century believers who come from a Jewish background. And so they knew who the prophets were. And the prophets were people who spoke God's truth on behalf of God to God's people. And they would show up on the scene. And the prophets, they loved their nation. They loved their people. And they wanted more than anything else for their people, the people of Israel, to turn back to God and to follow Him. But most of the time they were ignored. And sometimes rejected. And sometimes persecuted. Not by the enemies, but by their very own people. Give you some examples. Take Moses as an example. You know, Moses, he really didn't go looking to be a leader, but God called him to lead the people of Israel out of captivity in Egypt, to lead them to freedom. And listen to what he says one day. "Then Moses cried out to the Lord, 'What am I to do with these people? They are almost ready to stone me.'" I mean, he had done right and gotten treated all wrong. And then there's Elijah. I mean, Elijah was a prophet, and he led this incredible spiritual turnaround in the hearts of God's people. And it was an amazing revival that took place, but that upset the king of Israel and his lovely wife, whose name was Jezebel. And so they came after Elijah. They literally wanted to kill him. And Elijah one day was afraid, it says, and ran for his life. And he says, "I have had enough, Lord." He said, "Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors." Just doing what God called him to do. Just doing right. And he gets treated all wrong. And then, of course, Jeremiah spoke the bold truth of God to a people whose hearts were very, very hard. And there's this verse in chapter 26. It says, "But as soon as Jeremiah finished telling all the people everything the Lord had commanded him to say," catch that the Lord had commanded him to say, "the priests, the prophets, and all the people seized him and said, 'You must die.'" Okay, here's what you have to understand. There are going to be times in life when you do exactly what God has called you to do, when you live exactly how God has called you to live. And some people aren't going to respond well to that. And you will not always be treated well simply because you have been living well. And for me, this is, I think, one of the most difficult times in my life to be patient. Because if I feel like I have been treated unfairly or unjustly, sometimes, I'll be honest with you, that just eats at me. And I can become bitter so easily, and I just want to fix it, and I want to make it right, and I want what in my mind is justice. And you know, it's okay to defend yourself, and it's okay to seek justice through the appropriate channels, but I have to keep reminding myself of this. This is not my home. And if you're a follower of Christ, this is not your home. And we don't live for the applause of this world. We live our lives for an audience of one. And following him is all that matters, regardless of the consequences. And someday we will stand before him and hear him say, "Well done, good and faithful servant." And that is the only voice that'll matter. So, in times when you've lived right but are treated wrong, you got to have patience. You got to focus on the destination. And number 3 is this: when you've been faithful to God, but it doesn't seem like he's been faithful to you. I mean, come on, it is difficult to be patient when your life is full of problems and you don't understand why, and it seems so undeserved. And God seems so silent. Verse 11, James goes on, he says, "As you know, we consider blessed those who have persevered." And he says, "You have heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about." And you may know the story of Job if you've been around church for a while. But Job was a man who was completely and utterly faithful to God. In fact, God describes Job this way in Job chapter 1. He says, "There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil." And in spite of the fact that Job was blameless and upright, he suffered deeply. And if you know his story, you know that over a period of about 2 days, he was bankrupt, all of his kids were killed, and he contracted a terrible, terrible disease. And everything in his life was gone except his wife, and that was kind of a mixed blessing, to be honest with you. Job chapter 2, his wife said to him, "Are you still maintaining your integrity?" She says, "Curse God and die." And he replied, "You are talking like a foolish woman. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" In all this, Job did not sin in what he said. I mean, this was a guy who suffered deeply, who had been so faithful to God, and it seemed at the moment as if God had not been faithful to him. So what was it that gave Job the ability to patiently persevere? I'll tell you what it was. He knew that this world was not his home. He knew that this was not his final, ultimate destination. Because in chapter 19, you find these powerful, powerful words, this incredible proclamation. He says this, "I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand on the earth. And after my flesh has been destroyed, yet I will see God. I myself will see him with my own eyes." And he says, "How my heart yearns within me." And some of you, to be honest, you have a hard time comprehending this and identifying with Job, because for you, when life is difficult and when the pain is real, you wonder if God is even there. And there are many people in this world who've given up on belief in God because they say, you know what, since there's pain and suffering in this world, then there must not be a God. And I can't respond fully to that objection in just a few minutes. But let me say this. If you believe that God can't exist because of all the pain and suffering in this world, all you've proven is this: that God, as you would like him to be, does not exist. That you've created kind of a job description for God, and you've got this image in your mind of who he should be and what he should do, and he's not measured up to that. And you say there can't be a God. Well, there can't be a God as you would like him to be, but that doesn't mean there is not a God. And I think that the saddest part of that kind of response is this: if your whole response to the pain and suffering of this world is to say that there is no God, then that is a great tragedy. Because the tragedy of deciding that there is no God is that the pain doesn't go away, right? The suffering doesn't go away if you decide there is no God. The only thing that goes away is your hope. And you have nothing left that could ever make sense out of all the difficulties of life, and nothing in your life that can ever bring meaning. And I think the only way to really make sense out of this messed up world is to realize that this world is not our home, that we are strangers here, that we are pilgrims here, that we are visitors on this planet, and this is not our true home, and we must never, ever forget that. You know, some people say, well, Christians have been talking about this for almost 2,000 years, but it seems like time just goes on, and the world gets worse and worse. Listen to this passage. Peter says this, but do not forget this one thing, dear friends. With the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like a day. So, 2,000 years may seem like a long time to wait for us. But in God's perspective, it is not. And then it goes on to say this, the Lord is not slow in keeping his promise, as some understand slowness. Instead, he is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance. And the fact that we're still here after 2,000 years is not a sign that God has forgotten about this world. In fact, it is just the opposite. It is a sign of his great love for this world, because every day is another day of opportunity, another chance to turn and accept his grace. And the truth is, at any moment, history could come to an end and eternity could begin. And when we step on the shores of eternity, death will be a memory, tears will be no more, and this life will seem like a vapor. And when the journey gets tiring, just remember that. Remember the destination. Now, in a few minutes, we're going to end our worship time together by celebrating communion. And throughout the room, there are 4 tables. And on those tables, there are some pieces of bread, and there are some cups of grape juice. And as we celebrate communion, in a little while, we're going to allow you to come to one of those tables and take a piece of bread and dip it in that juice and eat it. And this is a ceremony that dates back really almost 2,000 years. Jesus one night was with his disciples, and they were sharing one last meal together. It was the Jewish Passover meal. And this was the very night before he was going to be crucified. And during that meal, he gave a whole new meaning to these very simple elements. And he said this, Matthew 26, while they were eating, Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, take and eat, this is my body. Then he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, drink from it, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. And then in verse 29, he goes on to say this. He says, I tell you, I will not drink of this fruit of the vine from now on until that day when I drink it anew with you in my Father's kingdom. You see, Scripture tells us that someday when history ends and eternity begins, that all of God's redeemed people will sit down to a banquet, to a feast. The book of Revelation calls it a wedding feast. It's like our wedding reception, but on steroids. And Jesus said, whenever you drink of this cup, let it remind you of something. Let it remind you of that day when we will sit down together again, and we will celebrate like a bride and a groom on their wedding day. And so they leave the upper room, and they begin to walk, and they're on their way to a place called the Garden of Gethsemane, which is ultimately where Jesus would be arrested. And on their way, he continues this conversation with them. And here's what he said to them. John 14, he said, do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. He said, in my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, I would have told you. I'm going there to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me, so that you also may be where I am. And let me just stop there and give some explanation, because the cultural background behind this is fascinating. See, in those days when a young man got married, he didn't go out and rent an apartment or buy a house. He would make a place for himself and his bride at his father's house. He would literally build an addition onto his father's house, and that's where he and his new wife would live. And so the way that it worked was this. When it was time for a guy and a girl to be married, the parents of the bride and groom would settle on what was called the bride price, because the father of the bride was given a certain sum of money in exchange for his daughter's hand in marriage, which, as the father of 2 daughters, I'm kind of sad that that tradition has drifted away. But they would settle on the bride price, and then the families would meet together at the bride's home for the engagement ceremony. And the way it worked was this. The groom would take a silver cup and he would pour wine into it and he would drink from it. And then he would hand it to his prospective bride. And if she drank from it, it was her way of saying yes to him. And that became a covenant between them. And from that point forward, they were legally bound together. They were betrothed until their wedding day. And after the ceremony, the groom would leave and he would say, I'm leaving now and I'm going to my father's house and I'm going there to prepare a place for you. And when I've done that, I will come back and I will take you to be with me for the rest of our lives. Now, at that point, the bride had no idea when her wedding day would be. It could be 6 months away, 3 months away, 9 months away. It could be a year away. But from that point on, she lived with a sense of anticipation, knowing that at any time that day could come. That she was living at home with her parents, but that was not her true home. That was not her ultimate home. And so Jesus comes to us and he says, I love you and I want you to be with me. And then he paid the bride price at the cost of his own life. And then he says, I'm going to my Father's house, and I'm going there to prepare a place for you, and someday I will come and I will take you to be with me forever. And we don't know when that day will be, but we as the bride of Christ, we live with a sense of anticipation. And in those days when our hearts are troubled, and when life is difficult, and when things are so frustrating and so disappointing, we can find hope in knowing that this life is not all there is. That there is a time coming when death will be conquered, when every tear will be wiped away, and we will be home. In just a moment, the band is going to come back up and lead us in 2 more songs. And during that time of worship, you'll have the opportunity to make your way to one of those communion tables as we celebrate together. And this will be a time for us to look back and to remember a bloody cross and the love of a dying Savior. But also a time to look ahead in anticipation to everything that is promised to those of us who are followers of Christ in that day, someday, when we will be finally home.